En Carta a la Carta tenemos a una chef muy especial desde Inglaterra. Nos acompaña Hazel Southwell, periodista, como decimos en inglés, Freelance Journalist, una periodista libre que tiene una experiencia impresionante en el mundo motor. Hazel, Estefanía Ferreira and Edgardo Berg are welcoming you to Carta a la Carta. How are you?
I'm very well. Thank you so much for having me on the show. It's very exciting to be speaking to you.
Oh, thanks. Thanks to you in the first side, because it's an honor for us. Are talking with you about motorsport and about life, I think, because we share that, no? Motorsport is our life in a long way to say. To start our interview, can you tell us how did you get involved in the motorsport world?
Sure. So, like most people, I was a fan of motorsport. When I was a child, I started watching Formula One, so a very long time ago now. It was always a world that was super interesting to me. I've always been interested in the technology of cars and mechanical engineering, and the increasingly complex engineering in sports like Formula One. But it was something where I didn't necessarily know how I could be a part of it. Like most of us, unless you know someone who is already involved in motorsport, it's quite difficult to work out a way that you can be part of it. Especially, you know, this was before the internet and it was harder to meet and to connect with people. So I went away, worked in other fields as a journalist. And then in 2013, 2014, when Formula E first appeared, I realized that and when Formula One had gone hybrid, I realized there was a sort of gap for people needing a better understanding of the way that battery and hybrid systems work in the cars. And especially with Formula E, I realized there was an opportunity that it was much, because it was so new, it was kind of easier to work out how to get into it and be a part of it. So I started covering motorsport then, and then have worked in various roles around the sport. I worked for Honda in Formula One. I've been a journalist for a long time, or throughout the whole time I've worked in motorsport, really, and previously on other subjects. And yeah, now I've been working in motorsport for the best part of 10 years.
Okay.
That's
Wow.
good. Which was the first race you attended, first as a fan and then as a professional?
I've been trying to work this one out, because you sent me this question.
Yes.
And I have to admit, I don't know. So I can't remember what the first race I went to was. I think it was probably a rally.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
But I'm pretty sure it would have been a rally. I didn't really grow up near any circuits, but there were rallies nearby. But I couldn't tell you which one. It would have been a local British rally, somewhere deep in the woods, getting gravel sprayed in. Which I love rallying, and rallying when I was younger was particularly big in the UK because of Colin McRae.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a lot of interest in it, and there was a lot of events that were taking place. Professionally, I also don't know, but I think it was some bike racing at a circuit I should have looked the name up of, but I haven't. But I think it's owned by Michelin, and it's right down in the south of France, kind of near Montpellier. which is a town I was working in 2001, 2002. And I went there. I was actually working as a promo girl, so one of the girls in leotards that kind of holds up a sign. But that would have technically been the first race I went to professionally.
Wow. It's an impressive throwback, I think. We are discovering another Hazel that we don't know a lot of,
Yes.
I think.
Yeah.
So, do you have a favorite driver? Or if so, who is he or she and why?
So like everyone who is a Formula One fan or a motorsport fan, there are some people who stand out as so good that you can't really be a fan of the sport and not be a fan of watching them compete in it because they are so exceptional. So people like Lewis Hamilton, Michael Schumacher, of course, and you know, a few of the other multiple time champions I've certainly been a big fan of and am a big fan of. Just simply because they're so good at the sport. But I think probably if I had to pick a favorite driver, it would be Jean-Eric Vergne, who I know very well from Formula E, and who has had a very interesting journey as a driver. He had a very difficult time in Formula One, and then when he left Formula One, and who then had to come back from. Oh, I'm so sorry, my cat is.
It's cat Indy. Don't worry.
Oh,
Indy,
To
sure.
Indy, le perdonamos todo a Indy, no hay problema. Le contamos a la audiencia que Hazel tiene a Indy.
Yeah, she's all right. She just likes to speak sometimes. she likes to join in. But yes, but my favorite driver would be Jev because I think he's been through a lot and he's a funny guy. He's an interesting character.
Interesting is the word, I think, about Jeff.
Talking about people involved in motorsport, how have you seen the role of women just in series? Because we are focusing on women drivers, such as from Lella Lombardi, and I can move onwards to Michelle Mouton. For us, we believe that one of the best nowadays is Molly Taylor at Extreme. She's a fantastic driver. But have you witnessed a growth in their participation in motorsport in the last years?
I've definitely seen that there's been a bigger push with series like Formula E when it started, did have women drivers in, and was intended actually to have gender parity. And Extreme E does do that by forcing the teams. There's also obviously been a rise in programs like Iron Dames, in the FIA Women in Motorsport Commission's work, in things like W Series having started, although the series has some problems now. And there's certainly been more visibility of women as drivers and as capable drivers who can win and be very competitive. If you look at someone like Doriane Pin, I think there's a huge amount of excitement about how good she is in endurance racing. At the moment, the barriers to a female driver getting to, in particular, very high level motorsport like Formula One are very big, and they're mostly financial. It's very difficult to get sponsorship if you're on the junior ladder on the way up, if people don't believe that you'll make it to Formula One. And when you have Stefano Domenicali, the CEO of Formula One, saying no woman is going to make it in the next 5 years, that's very difficult then for, you know, drivers like Abby Pulling to go out and ask for sponsorship money and say, I will make it, when it's like, well, the CEO of Formula One just said you won't. And so that is a problem, and it's a real struggle for the drivers. Of course, there are programs like F1 Academy, which is heavily subsidized by Formula One and by kind of the junior series program, but it is only a Formula 4 program. They would still need a considerable jump in funding in order to be able to make it to Formula 3. And then an even bigger one to make it to Formula 2. But that is possible. There have been female drivers in Formula 3 and in Formula 2 and fairly recently. But the challenges remain pretty much what they've always been, which is that there is a lack of belief to back women drivers on their way up, and to sort of take them those last final steps into really professional series. I hope that is changing, and that when you see people like, as you say, Molly Taylor, or Clara Anderson in particular, has been really impressive in Extreme E, and you see them very much on pace with even hugely experienced men. You know, when you consider Clara Anderson is keeping pace with people like Matthias Ekstrom, like when she has very little experience and he's mind-bogglingly experienced. It's very impressive to see, and hopefully it begins to challenge this view that women simply aren't fast enough and aren't capable, and you know, all of these things that are said about, you know, women don't have the instinct to be competitive. Well, you know, tell that to Jess Hawkins and Abby Eaton, who, despite, you know, being partners and living together and having a dog, will, you know, very much went wheel to wheel every weekend in W Series, and I think hopefully what we're going to see is a substantial shift in that. There's certainly a lot more scrutiny of the failure to promote female drivers that I think will ultimately have a lot of benefit for the opportunities that they get.
Absolutely. We know in the same way that you are an active LGTBQ rights defender. So how is the LGTBQ community appreciated in motorsport? What can you see about that?
So there's a real lack of representation of LGBTQ plus people in motorsport. There have, over the course of Formula One, been 3 drivers who were out. Mike Butler, who was gay, a driver whose name I've just forgotten, who came out much later in life as pansexual, and Lella Lombardi, who, although I'm not sure she described herself as anything, openly brought her girlfriend to races. So there have been a tiny smattering of people. There have been in other series, there are a few out races, and certainly within local clubs and club racing, there are certainly some people who are openly out. There are also some figures in motorsport like Matt Bishop, I guess to some extent myself, and a few others who openly are active members of the LGBTQ plus community, as well as working in the sport. But we know that there are probably a lot more people who don't feel able to be open, and who find the world, which regrettably is a very conservative world. It's a very restrictive world, and it's not very open to or familiar with LGBTQ plus people. So yeah, it's, although things are I hope changing, I have no doubt in my mind that a Formula One driver or a Formula E driver or a WEC driver could come out as LGBTQ plus and not face a huge amount of professional difficulty. I don't think they'd be fired by their team. I certainly don't think they'd lose sponsors, because if you consider how terrible it would look for a sponsor to do that. But I do think that beyond very top level series, people would face prejudice. And in reality, we know that there would be a lot of horrible stuff said online. We've seen how Alonso fans in particular abused Matt Bishop recently and drove him off Twitter. And so I don't think we're only a few steps of the way there to making motorsport a welcoming and safe world for LGBTQ plus people, unfortunately.
So one driver who stood up and defended has been Sebastian Vettel. Did you have any chance to talk to him personally?
I haven't in recent years. I was really impressed by how sincerely he took on being an ally, being a good ally, being a representative. It's not something that there is a lot of in motorsport, and it's something very poorly understood. There's a lot more fear of LGBTQ plus people and of any association with LGBTQ plus people. And so that was really heartwarming to see, and his committed representation was really excellent. And I hope that continues in his work now he's left motorsport, as he's working on climate issues and social responsibility issues.
Give me a second. Wait a second. All right, because we have just lost Estefania. Yes, you are there. You came back, Estefania.
Yes, I don't know what happened. I'm thinking a lot of things that we share through internet, through Twitter, in fact. But it's I agree with Hazel that in the last few years we are seeing a lot of abuse in the social media with a lot of people to Lewis Hamilton. In other point of view, to Latifi, for example, and I think that we are a little point to make changes, big changes with our voice. So we share some scenarios with Hazel. So how did you get involved in Formula E world?
That's so basically I noticed it was happening and I was interested in it. And I started talking about it online because I could. I was working at the time for the BBC, and I started kind of exploring whether we could cover it a bit there. I was working for Radio 1 and I wanted maybe to, which is sort of it's a big young person's radio station. So I thought it was quite closely aligned, and yeah, to just sort of working on how I could cover it. And then eventually I sort of got in touch with the media team and said, I want to go to races. I want to kind of cover this properly. I would say I didn't necessarily really have a plan at first. But yes, I found myself working on my own stuff, and then quickly for some other sites, some Formula E specific sites, and also for Drive Tribe and Race Fans. And that was kind of where it started.
Hazel, how many Formula E races have you covered up to now?
Being 100% honest, I don't know if this figure is right, but I think so. There have been just over 100 Formula E races, and I think I have covered 74. That might not be completely the right number, but I think that's true, and it feels like it fits, especially because there were some that we couldn't go to, like the 6 races in Berlin during COVID. Although I did, of course, cover them remotely and through the virtual media center. But yeah, it is a lot of races, and it's been a privilege to have been in the championship so long.
Two things. First, to have a cover the famous 6-pack is a sort of badge for every single journalist who was in front of the computer, because it was a terrible task. I have.
It was during such there was a heat wave in London, and it was 42 degrees in my house, degrees Celsius in my house. So, and you know, this is the UK, it doesn't get that warm here. It was unbearable, and because it was just like every day I got up and there was another race in Berlin. It felt so surreal and so weird. But yes, I feel like all of us who covered it kind of collectively went through something that week.
And after those 74 races, taking apart the famous 6-pack, any funny anecdote that happened to you?
Gosh, I have lots. There's been lots of like standout races just because something extraordinary happened. There's certainly been a few very dramatic ones. So something that stands out sort of in a bad way, although Alex was actually fine from the crash, was speaking to Mitch Evans after he'd abandoned his own car to go and check on Alex Lynn after they crashed in Diriyah, which you don't see drivers do that very often, and it was a shocking moment, but it was also quite impressive to see Mitch's character and how much he obviously cared about Alex. In terms of funny things, I guess one of the funniest was probably, it was in Berlin, and I think it was 2019. And it was a podium of Sebastian Buemi, Lucas Di Grassi, and Jev. And they were all in a really silly mood, like a really silly mood for some reason. I don't know if they were all, quite often they're quite dehydrated when they get out the car, and then they swig some champagne and get quite silly quite fast. And they were overexcited. Lucas stole the microphone that was meant to be being used by the person running the press conference. Jeff did say, I can't remember, but it was particularly because at the time they were all champions. They were all, you know, the dominant drivers of Formula E, and seeing them behave like children, basically, was yeah, a very sweet moment.
Oh my, oh wow. I remember so and listened to you when you were part of the documentary And We Go Green. How were you invited to be part of this documentary? And did you write your own script?
Yes. So I randomly got an email from a guy called Christopher St. John, who is a producer on the film. And he just asked if he could do 10 minutes of filming with me in Zurich. And I honestly, I didn't really know anything about the project. I don't think he mentioned Fisher Stevens, but I also wouldn't have known who Fisher was if he had, because I'm not a film buff. And so I said, yeah, sure. Because I always say fine to filming requests. And I honestly thought it was a student film or something that was being made. But I was like, lovely, I'll come along, I'll do some filming. So I went to this hotel where they said they were filming in Zurich, alongside the race. And there were all these senior people from Formula E, like Ali Russell, who's very senior on the media side of things, and Alberto Longo, and they were all saying, like, it's so great that you've said you'll do this. And I'm like, well, maybe this is a bit more serious than I thought. And so I went into this interview, and it's really obviously like a big documentary with like a filming crew and budget and stuff. And all initially they were just like, we just want to ask you some questions. And the 10 minutes that we were supposed to be filming for turned into 3 hours. And I walked out having signed a release form thinking like, what did I just say? And although I am a member of the media, yeah, I don't have any media training myself. So I'm not used to being interviewed. And I'm thinking like, oh God. But then they asked me to come back in New York and to do some more filming with them. And eventually, I actually had very little knowledge of or insight into anything that was going on from when I finished filming to when it was released. So I was very surprised when the drivers saw it in Cannes. And then I found out that like I was narrating the film. But none of it was intended as narration. It was just me answering questions. So it was, yeah, it's completely honest, and it is absolutely my own words, my own script. But yes, it was a strange way that it came together.
It's another funny fact from Formula E world. Absolutely.
Hazel, you covered Formula E, but did you have the chance of covering Extreme E?
Yes, I went to, so Extreme E limits the number of people who attend on site for sustainability reasons. So I hadn't been to an Extreme E event before last year, when I got the opportunity to go to Punta del Este for the finale, which was fantastic, a really great experience, and very interesting as a series. It's so different from anything but also very like the early days of Formula E in some ways. You know, people are saying, oh, they're working in tents with not much in them. Well, yeah, so was Formula E at the start. If you look at a very early race, you see the garages and they've got like 2 laptops and a bag of tools in there. And now, of course, it's all very high tech and pit walls and all kinds of things. But yes, it's a really interesting series. It's certainly doing something and occupying a space that no other racing does. I think some people might think that talking about the environment is a turn-off for people watching a racing series, that people don't want that. I actually think it's very important to so many people, well, to all of us, because the planet, we only have one planet. But it's something that will actively attract people to watch a series if they feel it has an environmental benefit, or if it's sport for good. People are looking for purpose in sport, and that can be a huge differentiator.
Well, thank you.
Yes,
You remind me to read. Thank you very much.
Another funny fact for us. Well, you say that Extreme E reminds you the early times from Formula E. So a common name in Formula E and Extreme E is Alejandro Agag. Do you interview him? Who is he? How?
So Alejandro is a very interesting person in motorsport because he comes from a background in Spanish politics, which definitely has given him a lot of advantages in terms of the way that he's been able to build both Formula E and Extreme E. He understands the motorsport world. He ran some junior teams before he founded Formula E, and he was associated with motorsport. He came up with the idea for Formula E at dinner with Jean Todt, who was then the head of the FIA. So he certainly did have a background in motorsport. But the way that he understands how politicians and the politics of, say, talking to cities about hosting races, or about negotiating to go to certain regions with Extreme E, is a big part of why he was able to make them successful where other people might have really struggled. And it was still very difficult, but it's certainly a factor that makes him not unique in motorsport, but which has given him a very strong background for the kind of thing that he chose to do. He's a very big character. He's very well educated about the, although he's not an engineer or someone who's involved in technology, he's someone who knows an awful lot about the technologies being used in the series that he runs. So in terms of the cars, the batteries, what's being used to charge them, the environment around them in terms of the automotive world, etc. And that's very important for speaking to manufacturers and encouraging manufacturers to participate. He's very funny. He's very high energy. If you ever see him, he's often kind of running around, kind of speaking very fast. He's someone who is very, very strong-willed. He made Formula E a success because he refused for it not to be a success, because he doesn't fail at things. And so although it had very, very hard times when he was the CEO, hard financially, hard in terms of, in season 3, there were a huge number of races that had to be reorganized long before COVID, when now races moving is more normal to us. And there were a huge number of challenges that had to be overcome, and he got through them by simply not letting them destroy his project. So yeah, I think he's a very interesting person. He's very funny, and he's very good to speak to. Yeah, so someone who has a real and very genuine passion for motorsport as well. It's something he does because he loves it.
Hazel, you were mentioning, when talking about Alejandro, that he deals with technology, he deals with environment. If we think about Formula E, we think about electricity, of course. But when we move into Extreme E, we have to think about electricity from hydrogen, and that's the point. What do you think of hydrogen? Do you think that hydrogen can be the real future in automobiles?
I think hydrogen is currently a very difficult proposition. It's something, so as things stand, in order to make clean hydrogen from electrolysis, especially electrolysis of salt water, because we need to conserve fresh water where possible, the return of the energy that you use to make the hydrogen, when you then use that hydrogen in a fuel cell car, or particularly in a combustion car, there's very little efficiency. You get back a fraction of the energy that you had to use to make it. There's also the problem of, there are some hydrogen cars around. BMW have a hydrogen X5, and the X5 is a huge car. It's a really big SUV. In order to put 6 kilograms of hydrogen into the car, they had to actually fit a tank so big that it creates a ridge in the floor of the down the center of the cabin, between the seats, because there was simply nowhere else to put it. Storing hydrogen is very difficult. There's some major risks associated with it as well. Hydrogen tanks have to be very well maintained. They have to be extremely rigid. You have to have no seepage whatsoever, because if oxygen comes into contact with the I'm so sorry. If oxygen comes into contact with hydrogen, so if normal air gets into the tank, then it will catch fire.
Yes.
And that would be quite cataclysmic. So storing hydrogen, transporting hydrogen is very difficult unless you do something like combine it with carbon from a carbon capture program, in order to turn it into methanol and then reform it when you get there, because methanol is easier to move. But the problem you have there is that capturing carbon takes a huge amount of energy. So something that already was energy inefficient is now very energy inefficient. And when you reform the methanol from, or reform the hydrogen out of the methanol, you create CO2. So you're kind of circulating a problem. I think that said, there are some contexts in which hydrogen would make a meaningful improvement. And there are some contexts in which hydrogen makes sense. It can be carried as ammonia as well as methanol, and ammonia is better when reformed. It's also in very remote locations, where, for instance, you might be able to generate a huge amount of solar power in the middle of a desert. But there's no obvious way, to build grid infrastructure to take that power away from a solar plant in a very remote location would probably not be very practical, but it might make more sense to transport it as to use that energy to reform hydrogen or and then store it as ammonia and move it subsequently like that, rather than having huge power plants. And as we move to renewables, it could be important as a form of energy storage. I still think there are probably in most contexts better ways, more efficient ways, but it's possible. It's also so 94% or well 98% of hydrogen that is used industrially currently comes from fossil fuels, mostly from gas reformation. And although using fossil fuels is very negative for the environment, there would be a justification for using fossil fuel hydrogen rather than diesel in combustion cars. You can convert a diesel combustion engine to run on hydrogen quite easily. It's not a very high power fuel, but you can just change some valves and the engine will run. It then stops emitting, although it needs to run at a low temperature in order to avoid emitting NOx particulates. But if you can make sure that it does, then it can resolve very serious air pollution problems associated with diesel cars. So that is a role where there is a very good justification for it as well. Breathing in diesel fumes at a level of pollution associated with normality, so the normal amount of pollution that you would see in an American city, was shown to make chess players make 17.6% more bad decisions. And these are chess grandmasters. These are people who are experts. But effectively, their decision making was being impaired by breathing normal traffic pollution, which, when you consider that drivers are the people most affected by pollution, and how likely that is that it could cause bad decisions behind the wheel, there's a reason that we don't let people drive drunk. And I think there's a very, very important case for cleaning air, both for general safety and because of the large numbers of health problems that it exacerbates.
Wow. I love listen to you when you explain us in that clear way to everybody can understand the problems that the hydrogen can afford, can no me sé en castellano, en inglés.
Produce.
Yeah. Yes. To us. So in order to take you leave, the last big news that you share with us on social media is that you are writing a book. So could you tell us the title or what is it about without the spoilers?
Yes. I'm super excited about this. It's a project for an American publisher called Carta, and it's called The Ladder. It's about how drivers get to Formula One, and about how most of them don't, because the majority of kids who start karting will not become Formula One drivers. But there's still lots of ways that people participate in motorsport along the way. There's lots of people who have interesting junior careers, even if they don't become professional drivers. So it's about the world of ways in which people get on that ladder, which isn't a very straightforward ladder. It's more like a climbing wall with lots of different routes and some bits that maybe are missing the grips, and looking at both what it takes to succeed and the barriers that drivers face in getting to the top. So, of course, talking about things like the fact that you really have to be in Western Europe to succeed in karting at some point. Everyone has to move. And that, you know, that's very difficult for people from anywhere else. And the lack of funding for diverse drivers, looking into the staggering costs of junior series, which are very high, and a real barrier to the sport in a way there is no other sport that costs this much money to participate in at the earliest levels. And also looking at all of the interesting characters. There's lots of really cool, interesting people who work in junior series. There's lots of very interesting stories to tell. And so I hope it's going to be, I don't want to shy away from or dissemble all the issues, but it's more of a celebration, and a book that I hope will be kind of like a guide to and you can't make a definitive work because I'd need to write 7 books, but something that gives a decent background to someone who wants to know how people become Formula One drivers, which I think people are quite interested in, especially now, because it's not clear.
Well, Hazel, from my part, I have no other questions. I want to thank you all the time you have devoted to us and all this, as we call here, this exquisite menu on racing cars, on Formula E and streaming and all and everything that you have just brought us. Stefania, have you got any other question for Hazel?
Only in Spanish. Fue fantástico. It was fantastic. I loved to talk to you directly and not only via tweets. And it's an honor. It was fantastic. I enjoy every minute of this interview. Thanks again.
No problem. Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, I really enjoyed it. Well, speak to you soon.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you.
No worries. Thank you.
Bye-bye.